The chandelier came down at 9:30 in the morning, and it took 3 seconds for the last nanny to quit. To be fair, it had been a magnificent chandelier. 1,200 hand-cut crystals, imported from the finest glassworks in the Eastern Territories, strung across the grand hall of the Onyx Citadel like a constellation frozen mid-explosion. Caleb Voss had paid an obscene amount of money for it. He had paid an equally obscene amount of money for the luxury designer bag that was currently being shredded between the teeth of his 4-year-old son, who was sitting on top of the wreckage on the highest beam of the vaulted ceiling, growling at anyone who looked up. The previous nanny, the 7th one this month, was somewhere down the marble corridor, still crying. Caleb stood at the center of the destruction and pressed 2 fingers to his right temple. The grand hall looked like a war zone. Crystal shards carpeted the floor in a glittering radius. One of the antique side tables had been overturned. There were claw marks in the mahogany paneling that definitely had not been there yesterday. And from the rafters, 30 feet above his head, a pitch-black wolf pup the size of a border collie stared down at him with enormous golden eyes and absolutely zero remorse. "Leo," Caleb said. The pup growled, low and theatrical, and chewed harder on the bag strap. "Leo, come down." The growl intensified. A small piece of leather rained down from the ceiling like a dark snowflake. Caleb exhaled through his nose. He was the supreme alpha king of the northern Lycan Court. He had ended territorial wars in a single night. He had negotiated treaties that reshaped the entire hidden world. Rogue packs went quiet at the mention of his name, and his 4-year-old son had just destroyed an heirloom chandelier for the 3rd time this week, and was currently daring him to do something about it from a structural beam. The insomnia did not help. 3 days without real sleep. Just shallow, restless hours that did nothing for the bloodlust that lived in his chest like a low coal fire. His suit jacket was already off. His sleeves were rolled past his forearms, which was as close to casual as the Alpha King got, and even that small concession felt like defeat. Marcus, his head of household security, appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who had already accepted his fate. "Sir, the next candidate is here." Caleb did not turn around. "Send her away." "She drove 4 hours, sir." "Send her away politely." "She is, Marcus paused. "She is already inside." Caleb turned. The woman standing in the entrance of his grand hall looked like she had walked in from somewhere entirely different. Not just a different building, but a different taxonomy of person entirely. She was tall for a woman, lean in the way that suggested function over aesthetics, and dressed in a fitted cream blouse and dark trousers that were immaculate in a way that felt almost pointed, given the state of the room. Her hair was a warm chestnut brown, pulled back loosely, and her face was the kind of quietly devastating that took a second look to fully register. High cheekbones, steady gray-green eyes, a mouth that was currently pressed into a perfectly neutral line. She was looking up at Leo. Leo was looking down at her. The pup had gone very still. The bag hung motionless in his jaws. Those gold eyes tracked her with sudden, sharp focus. Not the manic energy of a moment ago, but something more primal and calculating. Predator assessing predator. The woman tilted her head at him, the way someone might tilt their head at a mildly interesting weather pattern, and then she looked down and set her leather portfolio case on the one upright surface remaining in the room. "Eve Calloway," she said, without addressing anyone in particular. "I have a 9:30 interview." Caleb stared at her. "Are you aware that there is a wolf on the ceiling?" "Yes." She snapped open her portfolio, pulled out a single document, and laid it flat on the side table. "Is there somewhere I can hang my coat, or is that also structural damage territory?" From the rafters, Leo let out a sound, somewhere between a growl and a churr, the particular vocalization that usually preceded a lunge. Caleb knew that sound. Every nanny knew that sound. It was the 2-second warning before 40 pounds of feral pureblood came hurtling through the air at your face. Leo lunged. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, and Caleb would replay it for a long time afterward. The woman did not scream. She did not flinch. Her right hand went into the side pocket of her bag in a motion so automatic it registered as reflex rather than thought, and she sidestepped the trajectory of the incoming pup with a pivot that was, frankly, too precise for someone who had never been in this room before. Leo's jaws caught nothing but air. Before he could orient for a second pass, something was already in his mouth. A dense, specialized chew cylinder that she had produced from her bag and jammed between his teeth with the efficiency of someone inserting a magazine into a weapon. The effect was immediate. Leo's snarl muffled into confused working jaws sounds. His body went from combat tense to uncertainly occupied in the span of a breath. And then she reached down, gathered the loose scruff at the back of his neck with one hand, and lifted him. Just lifted him. One hand. 40 pounds of growling pureblood werewolf heir, dangling in midair by his scruff with his paws paddling uselessly at nothing, staring at her with an expression that, on a wolf, managed to convey something very close to indignation. The chew toy was working fast. The paddling slowed. Leo's golden eyes went from furious to glassy, and then he made a sound that Caleb had never heard come out of his son in 4 years of chaotic existence. A small, soft whimper, the sound of a very young animal who had just stopped fighting and decided, without quite understanding why, that this was acceptable. The woman looked at the pup hanging from her hand. The pup looked back at her. She adjusted her grip slightly, cradling him against her side with a brisk, practiced motion, and the pup tucked his chin over her forearm and closed his eyes. The grand hall was absolutely silent. Caleb became aware that his mouth was open and closed it. The woman dusted a crystal fragment from her sleeve, picked up her document from the table, and crossed the ruined floor toward him with Leo clamped comfortably under her arm and still working the chew toy with the solemn focus of a creature who had discovered religion. She stopped 2 feet away, held out the document, and looked at him with those gray-green eyes that had absolutely nothing in them that resembled being impressed by him, which was a sensation Caleb could not recall experiencing from another adult in recent memory. "My contract," she said. He took it. He looked down at it. His eyes found the hourly rate line, and he looked up at her. "That is a considerable number," he said. "I accept payment weekly. No exceptions." She reached into her bag again and produced a second, shorter document, which she clipped to the first. Addendum. I am not liable for furniture, fixtures, or personal property that is damaged during working hours if the damage occurs outside my line of sight or occurs due to pre-existing behavioral conditions in the subject. She nodded once at Leo, who had now pressed his entire face into her rib cage. He had already established the behavior before my employment. That's not on me. Caleb looked at her. He looked at his son, whose tail had started a slow, contented wag against her hip. He looked at the 1,200 shattered crystals on his floor, and the claw marks in his paneling, and the remains of a bag that had cost more than most people's monthly income, and the spot on the ceiling where the chandelier had been. Do you have references? He said. 3, all classified. I beg your pardon? Former clients who cannot be named for professional confidentiality reasons. I can provide contact verification through a secure channel if that is a hard requirement. She looked at him without blinking. It usually isn't. He studied her face for a long moment. She did not fill the silence with explanation or reassurance, which was its own kind of data point. Her pulse, from what he could read of it, was perfectly steady. Not elevated. Not performed calm. Actually steady, the way a person's pulse was when their body had no reason to be alarmed because it was not capable of being alarmed by things like feral werewolf pups launching themselves from the ceiling. That was unusual. That was, in fact, the most unusual thing about a morning that had already contained a falling chandelier. Leo made a sleepy sound and adjusted his nose beneath her elbow. Caleb took a pen from his inner jacket pocket, turned to the signature line on the contract, and signed it. You start today, he said. I already have, she said, and reached out and took her copy of the contract back with the calm of someone who had never considered any other outcome. Outside the tall windows of the Onyx Citadel, the morning light fell clean and silver across the skyline of Silverwood City, and Caleb Voss stood in the ruins of his grand hall and had the distinct, unsettling sense that something had just shifted in the architecture of his life in a way he did not yet have language for, held in place by a woman who had walked into chaos and treated it like a 9:30 appointment she had been mildly early for. By the end of the first day, Leo had a schedule. This was, by all accounts, a minor miracle. In 4 years of existence, Leo Voss had never operated on a schedule. He had operated on impulse, destruction, and the particular anarchic energy of a pureblood wolf whose magic was too large for his small body and leaked out sideways as chaos. He had shredded 7 nannies, 2 structural support beams, and 1 irreplaceable portrait of Caleb's great-grandfather. He ate when he felt like it, slept when he collapsed, and treated every waking hour as an open brief for creative demolition. Eve dismantled all of that by Tuesday morning. She arrived each day at 7 sharp with a bag that clinked faintly when she set it down and which no one had yet been permitted to look inside. Her first act was always the same. She produced a slim silver whistle from her collar, blew 2 short notes, and waited. By the 3rd day, the sound of those 2 notes produced in Leo an effect that Caleb could only describe as Pavlovian awe. The pup would come skidding around whatever corner he had been demolishing, slide to a full stop 2 feet in front of her, and sit. Tail hammering the floor. Eyes enormous and fixed on her face with an intensity that suggested he was taking minutes. The obstacle course appeared on day 4. Caleb came down to the East Wing courtyard at 6 in the morning to find Eve had commandeered the space with a thoroughness that implied she had been planning it for some time. There were low barriers spaced in precise intervals, a series of suspended rope objects at varying heights, and what appeared to be a crawl tunnel constructed from reinforced packing material. Leo was already running it. Eve stood at the center with a stopwatch and a voice that had apparently 2 settings, quiet precision and a sharp command tone that carried exactly as far as she needed it to, and no further. Barrier. Good. Tunnel. Go. Wait. Leo. Wait. A beat of tension. Leo vibrated at the tunnel entrance, every muscle coiled, ears pinned forward. Go. The pup exploded through it and came out the other side looking deranged with joy. Caleb watched from the upper terrace with his coffee going cold in his hand. He told himself he was there to supervise. That was the Alpha King's prerogative and responsibility, to oversee activities conducted on Citadel grounds involving his son and heir. It had nothing to do with the line of Eve's shoulders as she crouched to examine Leo's paw placement on the barrier landing, or the way she spoke to the pup. Not baby talk, never baby talk, but direct and consistent, and somehow deeply warm underneath the precision, the way a person speaks when they mean every word they say. The bite control work started the same week. This was the one Caleb had been skeptical about. Leo's bite control was non-existent. It was the central catastrophe of his young life. Too much power, no filter between impulse and action, jaws that could shear through hardwood without effort. 3 trainers hired specifically for this purpose had failed inside of a day. Eve used a series of graduated resistance toys and a hand signal that she introduced with such patience and such absolute refusal to react to failure that the pup eventually, confusedly, began to comply just to see what the approval looked like. By Friday, Leo was taking food directly from her palm with a gentleness that Caleb found quietly extraordinary. The pup was still a small disaster in most other respects, but he was a disaster with an emerging sense of structure. And structure was the thing, Eve said briskly when Caleb mentioned it, that every young predator needed before anything else. Caleb had a feeling she was not talking only about Leo. The insomnia reached its peak on a Thursday night, 11 days into Eve's employment. He had felt it building for 2 days. That particular pressure behind his sternum, that was not quite pain and not quite rage, but something that lived between them. The bloodlust cycling up as it did in the dark months, when his wolf demanded release, and his own disciplined control ground against it like tectonic plates. He had sent the household staff to the far wing. He had locked his study. He sat behind his desk and focused on breathing through the roaring that was filling the back of his skull, and told himself he had managed this alone for years, and tonight was not different. Then he put his fist through the wall. The plaster gave way with a sound like a gunshot. He stood there with his hand buried in the wall, chest heaving, his eyes burning with the amber gold glow that meant the wolf was very close to the surface. And the roaring in his head did not diminish at all. The study was in ruins, papers scattered, one bookshelf overturned, the heavy oak chair splintered against the far wall. He did not remember doing all of that. The door opened. He turned, with every ounce of alpha pressure radiating off him in a wave that would have driven a grown wolf packmate to the floor. It was not a conscious choice. It was the bleed-off of power that happened when control slipped, and it filled the room like a physical force, the air thickening with it, with the weight of something old and lethal that wore the shape of a man. Eve walked in and looked at him. She did not go to the floor. She did not take a step back. She stood in the doorway in a dark knit pullover and bare feet, her hair loose around her shoulders, and looked at him with those gray-green eyes that were, as they always were, completely level, and then she walked across the destroyed study toward him with the unhurried pace of someone approaching a weather event they had encountered before and had opinions about. "Sit down," she said. "You need to leave." His voice was not his own. Too low, the edges fraying into something with gravel in it. "Now. You're not going to do anything. Sit down." She said it the way she said barrier and wait to Leo, with that same even certainty that did not allow room for a different outcome. And something in him, the part that was still the man and not the burning wolf, responded to it in spite of himself. He sat on the edge of the overturned desk because it was the only surface left. Eve stepped behind him and put her hands on either side of his temples. The pressure was precise. Not gentle, not tentative, targeted. 2 fingers on each side, angled slightly forward and down, with a kind of focused force that felt architectural, like she was addressing specific load-bearing points. He knew pressure point work in the abstract, had trained in combat applications of it. This was not that. This was something older and more specific. The knowledge of someone who had mapped the nervous system of predatory creatures the way a cartographer maps coastlines, methodically, in the field, under conditions that did not allow for error. The roaring eased. Not all at once. Gradually, like a tide receding, the pressure behind his sternum loosened, and the amber light behind his eyes dimmed to something less urgent. His shoulders dropped 2 inches without his choosing to let them. He became aware of his own breathing normalizing, in, out, measured, and of her hands steady at his temples, and of the absolute quiet she was generating just by being the calmest thing in the room. "When did you last sleep?" she said. "Define sleep." "More than 90 consecutive minutes." He said nothing. She made a sound that was not quite a sigh and was not quite judgment, and was somehow both. "There are herbal compounds that work for Lycan insomnia," she said, in the tone of someone reading from an internal index. "Non-synthetic. I'll bring them tomorrow." He turned his head slightly and looked at her from the corner of his eye, and she looked back at him with that face that never gave him quite enough to read, and neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that a human nanny should not know what worked for Lycan insomnia. He filed it. He had been filing things about Eve Calloway since the moment she sidestepped his son in midair, and the file was getting thick. She left without ceremony, closing the study door behind her, and Caleb sat in the ruined room and breathed and felt, against all logic, almost calm. The jealousy started the following week and was, he would privately admit, fairly humiliating. It was the evenings that did it. After Leo's final training session and his dinner and the brief ferocious zoomies that indicated a well-exercised pup burning off the last of his energy, the pup would find Eve wherever she was and install himself in her lap with the focused determination of someone claiming territory. She would be reading, or writing in the small notebook she always carried, or simply sitting, and Leo would circle twice and collapse across her thighs and present his belly with the trust of a creature who had decided, without consultation, that this person belonged to him. And Eve would scratch his belly, slow and absent, the way you do something you do not know you are doing. Caleb had stood in the doorway of the sitting room and watched this on 4 separate evenings, and had, each time, experienced a sensation he had not felt since he was significantly younger and significantly less dignified. He was 34 years old. He ran a court. He had signed documents that ended conflicts spanning decades. He was watching his wolf pup get belly rubs and experiencing something that a therapist, if he had one, which he did not, because alphas did not, would almost certainly describe as envy. Leo cracked one golden eye open, looked directly at Caleb in the doorway, and tucked his nose more firmly into Eve's side. Caleb turned and walked away with great composure down the corridor, and if he stood there for a moment with his head tipped back against the wall, that was nobody's business but his own. The attack came on a Wednesday, which Eve had always found was the most statistically common day for ambushes. Not Monday, when targets were alert and reoriented after the weekend. Not Friday, when people were distracted. Wednesday, when routine had set in deep enough to dull the edges of vigilance. She had made note of this pattern 11 years ago, and had never found a reason to revise it. She was in the kitchen making Leo's 4 o'clock meal when the perimeter alarm tripped. Not the Citadel's alarm. That was Caleb's system, layered and excellent, and still 7 seconds behind her own. She had installed her personal sensors on day 2. 12 thin pressure filaments woven into the exterior ground floor window casings, calibrated to distinguish between wind load and deliberate force. The vibration that ran through her left wrist, from the small receiver band she wore under her sleeve, told her, East Wing, multiple contact points, simultaneous entry. Not a single intruder. A coordinated breach. Strike team. She set down the food bowl without hurrying. Leo was in the adjoining room, working a chew toy with focused intensity, and he lifted his head when she appeared in the doorway, not alarmed, reading her, the way he had learned to read her in the past 2 weeks. She gave him 2 short notes on the whistle, and he was on his feet immediately, ears forward, tail high. She crossed to him, picked him up against her side, and carried him at a steady walk to the reinforced safe room at the center of the East residential wing. Caleb had shown it to her on her first day with the gravity of someone disclosing something sacred. She had noted, without commenting, that it was exactly where she would have put it. Interior, load-bearing walls on 3 sides, ventilation independent of the main system, electronic lock with manual override. She set Leo down inside it. He looked up at her with those enormous gold eyes, reading the air, reading her face, and she could see the moment his instincts shifted from play to something older and more serious. The awareness that was coded into pure-blood wolves from birth. The recognition that the calm the person in front of you is performing is not the same as ordinary calm. "Sit," she said. He sat. Perfectly. Tail pressed flat, spine straight, watching her with an attention that had no whimpering in it and no panic, just absolute focused trust. She locked the door. Then she reached under the kitchen apron she was still wearing, unclipped the thigh holsters she had worn every day since she was 19 years old, and drew both blades. They were 22 inches each, dark as cooled slag, ground from meteor iron ore that her former guild had imported at extraordinary expense, because it was the only terrestrial alloy that held an edge against lichen hide without requiring silver. And she had never worked for the kind of operation that limited its options. The handles were wrapped in a grip material that absorbed sweat and did not slip. She had sharpened them last Sunday, as she did every Sunday, sitting at the kitchen table while Leo slept on her feet. She pushed up her sleeves to the elbow and walked toward the sound of boots on broken glass. There were 6 of them entering through the east dining room windows, and she stopped in the corridor and watched them come through the breach with the particular assessment of someone who has spent a long time in rooms exactly like this one. They were wearing matte tactical gear and carrying the kind of equipment that did not come cheap. Signal jammers, restraint systems, weapons loaded with silver compound rounds. Professional. Well-funded. The kind of organization that had done this before and gotten away with it. She recognized the unit patch on the nearest one's shoulder. Ashen Cross. One of the extreme guilds that operated outside the main hunter councils, which meant they had no oversight requirements, which meant they had come here to make a point rather than make an arrest. The point, she gathered from the file she had read on them 3 years ago and never fully closed, was usually a body count. The lead hunter swept a flashlight beam into the corridor and found her standing there in her apron with 2 drawn blades and an expression that had nothing in it he was expecting. He hesitated. That half-second was information she filed immediately. "Calloway," he said. "We know what you are. We know why you're here." His voice had the flat, scripted quality of someone delivering a prepared statement. "Step away from the wolf spawn's wing, and we don't have to make this messy." Eve looked at him. She looked at the 5 people fanning out behind him. She looked at the silver compound weapons and the restraint line coiled at the second one's hip and the body camera on the third that was either recording or transmitting, and she made a precise, comprehensive, unhurried assessment of the room. "You believe I'm here to assassinate the pup," she said. "We believe you've embedded to gain access to—" "No," she said, not unkindly, the way you correct a misconception that is about to cost someone their evening. "I'm his nanny." Then she moved. She came in low and fast under the line of the lead hunter's weapon, inside his effective range before he could recalibrate, and the first blade went through his gun arm at the inner elbow. Not killing. She was not here to kill. She was here to remove threats from a child's home. And the gun hit the floor, and she was already past him, rolling her shoulder under the grab from the second hunter and coming up inside his reach to drive the pommel of the second blade into the hinge of his jaw, with exactly enough force to drop him without permanent damage. He went down. She stepped over him. The third and fourth came together, which was the right call tactically and still not sufficient. She read the vectors of their approach in the tension of their shoulders before they committed to movement, the way she had learned to read intention from the body's telegraph before language catches up. And she pivoted into the gap between them rather than away from it. Elbow to the third one's solar plexus, hard and precise. Blade flat against the fourth one's forearm, redirecting the reach, using his own momentum to spin him into the wall face first. The wall won. 5 and 6 broke apart and tried to flank, which she had been expecting since they entered the room. She gave the fifth one 2 steps of apparent retreat to build his confidence, and then she stopped and let him run onto a controlled hold that leveraged his body weight against itself, twisting him to the floor in a way that his own joints were doing the work before he could assess what was happening. She pinned him there with a knee between his shoulder blades and her full attention on the 6th, who had stopped 2 meters away and was pointing a weapon at her with hands that were no longer steady. She looked at him across the room. She was breathing harder than usual. Not much harder. "That's a silver composite round," she said. "You're operating on the assumption that I'm either human, in which case it doesn't matter, or Lycan, in which case it does. You're working without enough information." She applied slightly more pressure to the shoulder under her knee. The person beneath her made a constrained sound. "Put it down!" The 6th hunter put it down. She zip-tied the commander's wrists with the restraint line from Hunter 2's own kit and placed her boot on the center of his chest and stood there and waited, because she had learned a long time ago that the arrival always came after the perimeter breach alarm, and she had heard the Citadel's own alert system trip 6 minutes ago, which meant someone had been notified. She did not have to wait long. The main doors came off their hinges. Not opened. Off their hinges, which was the distinction that told her exactly how elevated Caleb's state was, because those doors were 3-inch reinforced hardwood with iron banding and the kind of frame designed to hold against a pack charge, and they came away from the wall as if they had been installed carelessly. Caleb Voss filled the doorway in a way that was not entirely metaphorical. The alpha pressure preceded him into the room like a pressure wave, the air thickening with it, the unconscious hunters on the floor flinching, even in unconsciousness. His eyes were fully amber. His suit jacket was gone. He was radiating the particular controlled violence of someone who had driven very fast from somewhere very far and had been running full combat protocols in his head the entire way. He took in the room. He took in the 6 hunters in various states of incapacitation. He took in the shattered window. He took in the blood, which was not substantial but was present and was not hers. He took in Eve standing in the center of it all in her kitchen apron, blades loose at her sides, one foot resting with complete composure on the chest of the man wearing the Ashen Cross commander's insignia. He stood very still for a long moment. "Leo," he said. "Safe room, east wing, unharmed." She pulled a small key card from her apron pocket and held it out. "He has been sitting on command for approximately 11 minutes and is probably developing opinions about it." Caleb crossed the room in 4 strides, took the key card, and was gone down the corridor. She heard the safe room door open. She heard Leo, in the particular register of a wolf pup who has been patient for an extended period and is now expressing this at volume, greet his father with an enthusiasm that involved a significant amount of small pause. She reached down and retrieved the body camera from Hunter 3's kit and looked at the lens and thought about what it had recorded and made a decision in the span of a breath about what the next 24 hours were going to require. Caleb came back to the doorway of the east dining room, holding a furiously tail-wagging black wolf pup against his chest. He looked at Eve. He looked at the blades. He looked at her thigh holsters, now visible below the hem of the apron, where she had not bothered to lower her sleeves. He looked at the specific way she was standing over a subdued hunter commander with the body language of someone who had never, in any dimension of her actual life, been a nanny first and anything else second. His amber eyes were fading slowly back to their ordinary dark. His voice, when he spoke, was very level. "Who," he said, "are you?" Eve looked at him across the ruined room, and behind him Leo was wagging his tail, and she thought about all the versions of the answer to that question and chose the one that was true, which was also the one that was going to make everything significantly more complicated. "Someone who needed somewhere to be," she said, "and a reason to stay." He crossed the room in 8 strides, and she had read enough threat approaches in her life to brace for the one she was expecting. The alpha closing the distance between himself and a hunter who had operated under false identity inside his home, inside his security perimeter, inside the daily life of his son and heir. She had run this scenario in the back of her mind since day 3, the contingency plan for the moment the cover dissolved. What she would say, how she would explain, what she would accept as a proportional consequence. What she had not planned for was Caleb Voss reaching her, pressing both hands to either side of her head with a gentleness so controlled it had force in it, and checking her face. Not threatening. Checking. His eyes moved with that hunter's precision she had come to recognize in him, rapid, comprehensive, cataloging, across her forehead, her jaw, down to her neck and arms, cataloging the blood on her with the specific desperation of someone distinguishing between hers and not hers. "Where are you hit?" he said. "I'm not. Eve." His voice on her name had a raw quality she had never heard from him, stripped of the gravel and the command register, something underneath it that was not the Alpha King and was entirely the man. "Where are you hit?" "None of this is mine," she said. "I'm telling you the truth. I'm not injured." He exhaled, a long, shuddering thing that came from somewhere deep in his chest, and then he pressed his forehead briefly against hers in a gesture she did not know werewolf protocol well enough to name precisely, but understood completely, in the language that required no translation. Behind them, the hunter commander shifted and made a pained sound, and Caleb turned his head in that direction without stepping back. "If anyone in your organization," he said, to the room, to the walls, to anyone currently breathing and capable of transmitting the message, touches my nanny again, I will burn your guild to the foundation and I will salt what remains. It was not a threat delivered with heat. It was a statement delivered with the absolute cold certainty of someone describing a law of physics. That is a promise from the Supreme Alpha of the Northern Court. Choose carefully how you spend it. Then the second alarm tripped. Her wrist receiver registered it before the Citadel's system did. The broad perimeter, exterior walls, multiple vectors. Not a strike team this time. A siege. She was already pulling away from the wall. "They sent the team as a probe," she said. The main force was waiting on confirmation. She moved toward the east corridor, recalibrating. "How many fighters do you have on the grounds?" 12. Half of them are with me." He fell into step beside her without discussion, which was the thing about Caleb that she had catalogued and filed and never entirely accounted for. He adapted to changing conditions without ego, the mark of someone who had survived a long time in genuinely dangerous situations. "What are we dealing with?" "Ashen Cross. Mid-tier extremist guild, well-funded, bad ideology. They don't negotiate." She did a rapid count in her head. The main force would be 20 to 30. It was the standard Ashen Cross deployment against a high-value Lycan compound. "They'll breach from 3 sides. They'll leave the north clear, because they'll expect retreat toward it. Don't retreat north." I wasn't planning to retreat anywhere. They came out through the main hall, into the torch-lit courtyard, just as the first section of the exterior gate came down. 6 hunters poured through the breach and met Caleb's 6 assembled pack fighters head-on, and the courtyard became immediate organized chaos. Not the panic of a surprise attack, but the brutal geometry of 2 forces that knew exactly what they were doing and were doing it in the same space. Eve went left. She always went left in a courtyard breach, because the left flank was typically covered by the strongest member of the opposing team, which meant it was the most dangerous position, and also the position that, neutralized, collapsed the most structural support. She cleared the first 2 hunters with a combination she had developed over years, specifically for armored opponents. Low sweep to the lead knee, redirect the fall, control the landing. Neither of them got back up quickly. Caleb went right, and she caught him in her peripheral vision and filed the data automatically, the way she filed everything. 6'5" of alpha werewolf, in a blood-stained white dress shirt, moving through a combat zone with the economy of motion that separated trained violence from raw power. He was not using his shift. She noted that he was restraining it, staying close to human form, which meant he was thinking about proportionality, even in the middle of a siege, and she filed that too, in the part of her index that was growing uncomfortably thick. The communication array team set up on the east wall lasted 40 seconds before something went wrong with their equipment. Eve did not see what, exactly, because she was occupied, but the timing suggested interference, and when she caught a flash of small dark movement along the base of the east wall between engagements, she understood. Leo had gotten out of the safe room. She did not know how. She would ask him later, not because she expected an answer a 4-year-old wolf could give, but because she wanted him to know the question had been asked. What she saw was a pitch-black wolf pup the size of a border collie moving along the base of the wall, with a focus that had nothing chaotic in it, nothing feral, just pure, concentrated intent. And the communication wires running from the hunter array were, one by one, being severed by jaws that were small but extremely precise. The array went dark. The hunter force's coordinated communication dropped. She could hear the change in their movement immediately, the fracturing of synchronization, the individual units losing the thread of the collective plan, and she used it, pressing forward into the gap that opened in the center of the courtyard when the left and right flanks lost contact with each other. It was over in 7 minutes. 22 hunters, down or restrained, or in retreat through the breach they had come in. Caleb's pack fighters were on their feet. Caleb himself was standing in the center of the courtyard with a split lip and his shirt in ruins and his eyes just beginning to fade from amber. And Leo came trotting across the broken flagstones toward Eve with his ears up and his tail in a full-speed arc. And she crouched and caught him against her chest, and he licked her face with the enthusiasm of someone who had done something excellent and knew it. "You cut the wires," she said. He sneezed on her. "That was tactically perfect," she said, and held him tighter than she intended to. Because he was fine, they were both fine, and the adrenaline was bleeding off now and leaving behind the particular awareness of things that could have gone differently. Caleb appeared above her and looked down at the two of them, and his expression was the one she had been watching develop for 17 days and had been refusing to name. He reached down and put his hand briefly on the back of Leo's head, the gesture of a father checking his son with his whole chest, and then he looked at Eve, and the courtyard was quiet, and no one spoke. He went down on one knee. She stood up. Leo looked between them and then trotted away with purpose, nosing along the base of the east wall, and returned moments later with something in his mouth. A small dark box, velvet-covered, which he set at his father's knee, and then sat beside it with the perfect straight-spined sit she had spent 2 weeks teaching him, his tail working slowly, enormously pleased with himself. Caleb picked up the box. "Leo has been keeping this for me," he said. "Since this morning, apparently, before I left for the meeting." He paused. "He knew before I did, which is not the first time and will not be the last." He opened the box. The ring inside was not a human ring. It was old, she could tell by the setting, the way the metal had developed the particular depth of color that centuries produced. And the stone at its center was a dark, deep blue that caught the courtyard light and held it. The Lycan Queen's ring, she would learn later. Passed to each alpha's mate across generations, kept in the vault between the choosing. "I want to amend your contract," Caleb said. His voice was quiet in the way that things are quiet when they carry the most weight. "Lifetime tenure, all assets, full legal standing in the Northern Court." He looked at her with those dark eyes that were, she had always known, reading her precisely, the same way she read everything, with complete attention, missing nothing. "And 2 wolves who belong to you. Whether you want that or not, it's already true. I'm just asking you to let us make it official." Leo put his chin on the velvet box and looked up at her. Eve looked at the ring. She looked at the man on one knee in a ruined courtyard in a blood-stained shirt. She looked at the small black wolf pressing his nose hopefully against her hand. She had spent 11 years moving through the world on assignment, tracking, neutralizing, closing files and departing before anything had the chance to grow roots. She had been excellent at it. She had been excellent at the moving and the leaving and the treating every location as temporary and every connection as operational. She had believed, with the conviction of someone who had never tested the belief, that she was built for it. That the part of her that could have wanted something fixed and permanent, and hers had been trained out early and cleanly, and for good reasons. She took the ring. It fit. Of course it fit. She would find out later that Lycan Queen's rings adjusted to their wearer, a piece of old pureblood magic that either meant the lore was true or meant that 300 years of metalwork had produced something remarkable. She thought, in the silence before she spoke, about all the hunts she had run and all the monsters she had found and what the years of it had actually taught her, which was not, as she had long believed, that the world was a threat matrix to be navigated with maximum competence and minimum attachment. What it had actually taught her, in the accumulation of 11 years and every dark room and every close call and every departure from every place she had almost let herself stay, was that the work was never the thing. The work was what you did when you did not have the thing. Sometimes the greatest hunt was not the killing of monsters. It was finding the ones brave enough to love you. It was the building of something that stayed. She looked at Caleb, still on one knee, watching her face with the full attention of a man who had decided. "The hourly rate stays the same," she said. He stood up, and Leo erupted from sitting position into a full-speed circle around both of them, barking at the moon just beginning to show above the citadel's broken parapet, and the pack fighters in the courtyard, hardened wolves who had spent the last 7 minutes in a siege, were laughing. And the onyx citadel had wreckage on its floors and gaps in its walls, and somewhere inside it a safe room that smelled like chew toys, and it was, without question or caveat, a home. If you enjoyed this action-packed paranormal romance audiobook, please hit the like button and subscribe for more epic stories.